We're back. You already know what time it is. It's R3's time. What we read. I'm Naila. I'm your CEO and your founder of R3, Realives, where we promote knowledge of self through education and activism. And what better way to do that than to read, write, and comprehend for your own understanding? So, of course, we're jumping right back into it. We are reading West Africa and Islam by Peter B. Clarke. Very extensive read. It goes deep and in depth about the introduction of Islam into West Africa and the effects that it had on the people from social classes to political class and even to the elites taking power and control and using this as a means to do that. So we're going to jump right into it. I'm going to pass it over to our host with the mostest. She's going to tell you a quick little summary and some of the logistics of how to find us. And we'll be back as we will be reading and reviewing actually chapter 7, the 1900s to 1960s, the colonial rule, an era of rapid expansion and development. And don't forget to wrap up the book so we can summarize our thoughts next week and also introduce the next book. To you.
Hey, it's Howard with the host of the Moses coming at you, our big Realize book club. And you can reach us every Tuesdays at our three Realeyes, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and the website where you can like, share, and follow for free, or you can donate on the website to support any of our causes. We have a scholarship, we do food drives, and we have given books to the needy, books, backpack supplies from here to Africa, and that's no lie, at our three Realize book clubs. So we are reading West African Islam by Peter Clarke. Well, we're ending. This is the last time that you'll be hearing this book. It will be listed on the website, so you can refer to all our books eventually that we read over the book club over the last few years. And I think this book club has been going on for 6 years, I believe, maybe close to 7, but at least 6. And I want to thank everybody for coming and listening and joining us. To wrap up the discussion of West African Islam by Peter Clarke, I share a quick summary of the key themes that we explored. The book closes by emphasizing how Islam in West Africa didn't arrive and dominate it. It evolved through centuries of exchange, adaptation, and resistance. Clarke shows us that Islam blended with local traditions to form something unique, not Arab Islam, but West African Islam. Muslim scholars, Sufi brotherhoods like the Qadiriya and Tijaniya, and long-distance trade helped spread Islamic ideas. These weren't just religious conversations. They brought literacy, new legal system, changes in politics and education. One key point, and taxes, I might add. One key point Clarke stresses is that Islam is a region. That Islam in this region often coexisted with traditional beliefs for a long time. Full conversion was rare. Most people layered Islamic practices onto existing worldviews. Then came European colonization, which disrupted Islamic institutions, but also gave rise to reformist movement. These reformers wanted a purified Islam and of what is saw as African innovations, but that tension actually helped define what West African Islam would become. Finally, Clarke ends by showing us that in the post-colonial West Africa, Islam continues to shape and identify justice movements, education, and resistance to oppression. It's not just a religion, but a living political and cultural force. That's the heart of Clarke's message. Islam is West Africa is not foreign. It is West African. And that's a quick summary. We're going to still go over a few of the chapters at the end of this book, and we will be concluding this book, but that does not prevent you from reading it. You don't need to see us to be us. Get this book, read it, learn for yourself. Back to you, kid.
Okay, perfect. And thank you for that summary. So yes, we're going to go ahead and just jump into chapter 7. Again, we're giving bits and pieces and different quotes and places to highlight in the chapter. This is an extensive chapter, to where we're not always reading the entire chapter. That's why it's important for you to read it, get the book and read it on your own as well. But we're going to jump into chapter 7. So it talks about the 1900s to 1960 colonial rule, an era of rapid expansion and development. So prior to this 1900s, there was not a lot of rapid expansion. They were entering different regions in West Africa, and we talked a lot about Mauritania on the west side of Africa, okay? And so now we're going to be talking about the European occupation of West Africa, and this is where you start to spread it. What I found in this chapter was very unique is that a lot of times we consider the Berlin Conference as the originator of entering into Africa rapidly and causing that scramble for Africa, if you don't know about it, in the 1800s, 1884 or so. But the Berlin Conference is not the first time that European countries actually went to Africa and began to take over, or try to take over, I should say. Take over as if we let go. But to try to take over and make their influence. So in chapter 7, it kind of brings that up, but then it also talks about how Islam was kind of meshed into the regular culture as well that was happening, to where it actually is a difference between Arab Muslims, Arab Islam, and the West Africa Islam, because you start to see a lot of the ancestral indigenous cultures be meshed into them. But in chapter 7 on page 184, we'll kind of just read a little bit there. I have a lot of highlights, so we'll kind of go over those. But it says, we're going to read the second paragraph. In this chapter, given among other things the limitations of space, I have not attempted to examine the growth of Islam, a complex process in West Africa as a whole during the colonial era, but instead I have decided to confine myself to considering at some length Islam's progress in Senegal, Upper Volta, and Ivory Coast, former French colonies, and in Nigeria, a former British colony. These case studies, along with some general comments on the development of Islam throughout West Africa, will provide an indication of the ways in which Islam developed and the rapidity and extent of its progress during the colonial era. I should point out, of course, that it was not always a case of expansion and growth. Islam in some areas made no progress whatsoever, and in others even decline. Before examining these issues of expansion and decline, however, I want to consider somewhat briefly the European occupation of West Africa, colonial policy towards Islam in West Africa, and the Islamic response to colonialism. So this is what chapter 7 overall, very extensive chapter, but this is what it's speaking about. So if we'll jump down to that next paragraph, it says the European occupation of West Africa, and I highlighted, prior to the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885, France, Britain, Portugal already had a foothold in West Africa. France possessed a relatively large colony in Senegal and had other settlements along the West African coast. The British were established in Freetown. Ironic that the name is Freetown and people were not being free because they were being converted over to someone else's religion. But anyways, the British were established in Freetown and the surrounding peninsula, in the island and the colony of Lagos, in the southern states of the Gold Coast, Ghana, and in Bathurst, which is Banjul, on St. Mary's Island at the mouth of Gambia. The Portuguese were in Quechua and Bissau, part of modern-day Guinea-Bissau, and in the islands of Sao Tome and Cape Verde. Elsewhere, the European powers frequently interfered in the internal affairs of West African states, a case in point being the British interference in the Niger Delta region. And if you ever heard of Niger Congo or the Niger Delta region, that's where they're talking about. Germany, of the European powers of the Berlin Conference, did not have colonial possessions in West Africa at the time of the conference was called, but before the delegates had dispersed from the conference, she had laid claim to Togo and the Cameroons. So my next highlight was on page 185, second paragraph. It says, the Berlin Conference did not directly initiate the European scramble for Africa in the 1880s, but rather laid down the rules to be followed by a European power if its occupation of a part of Africa was to be considered valid by the rest of Europe. Two sentences down from that on page 185, it says, Fedherbe, for example, during his second term as a governor of Senegal in 1863 to 1865, had presented a plan of expansion in West Africa to French government in 1863. The objective was to turn Senegal, quote unquote, into a compact and homogeneous territory bound by its natural frontiers. This meant that France, using Senegal as a base, would advance as far south as the Gambia, a British sphere of influence at the time, and east as far as Timbuktu on the Niger. This accomplished, Fedherbe explained, quote unquote, all the sources from which the trade of these coasts is drawn would be in our hands. So it made me think, I highlighted that because if we kind of have this reversed ideology and thinking now as the African diaspora, we need to take back the same lands for the same reasons why they took it in the first place. So all the sources from which the trade of these coasts is drawn would be in our hands. So I think it's important that we just keep that in mind as we're advancing to freedom and the redistribution of wealth across the African diaspora and given back to us, that we also too take over these places and take back these places so that we can have the trade and the coast in our hands. And I see that a lot with Ibrahim Traoré happening in Burkina Faso as well, taking back and establishing Africa for Africans once again. But anyways, on page 182, the last paragraph, it goes, I highlighted, supplied, therefore, with the most advanced military equipment available and benefiting from a relatively high level of industrialization, the European powers began the full-scale colonization of West Africa in the late 19th century. France acquired the largest amount of territory and began with the intention of administering it as a single unit and as the extension of France. So I wanted to just highlight that because now, you know, France is always considered the place of love, right? Everybody loves France and goes there, even somebody on this live, right? But if you think about it in the context that France actually acquired the largest amount of territory, and then when you start to hear too the reasons why they're doing this, I'm going to read over some of the quotes I highlighted, but it just brought to my attention that a place that can be considered such a lovely place, and the Eiffel Tower, everybody goes there as a romantic place. The most romantic language, right, is French, that you hear people say. They actually, too, are involved in it, but it's all off of a lie. Like, it's kind of like fluffing themselves up to make it seem like they have this heart of love. But if you hear about what they did in Africa from the beginning, trying to make, France a colony, but just an extension, they really called it. It was going to be in Africa. It was going to be the extension of France in Africa, which is why a lot of these countries in Africa, remember Africa's a continent, not a country, but why a lot of these countries in Africa do speak French. And remember, I always say you can always identify the colonizer by the language that is spoken, right? So these French-speaking countries were kind of bamboozled, and as we all know, not only with religion, but with slavery as well, but with France's process of assimilation. And acting like they wanted to assimilate themselves into this culture so that they would have the people who were colonized in Africa would have the same rights as the Frenchmen in France, which we know now to be false, right? But just to see their thinking of how they took over with these false hopes, that is what comes to mind, if that makes sense. So on page 185, so it goes on to say, the last paragraph, West Africa, according to this policy known as the policy of assimilation, was simply an extension of France and was referred to in Paris as a part of the quote-unquote overseas France, the La France de Outre-mer. According to one of the many versions of assimilation, France's African colonial subjects were to be given the same rights and treatment as Frenchmen. There were the assimilationists agreed no differences between the two that education could not eliminate. In addition, there was to be political, administrative, and economic identity between France and her West African colonies. So you colonize a people and you try to act like they're going to have the same rights as you with this colonization and coercion of their own religion, culture, and knowledge. And then you turn around and it's the opposite. You enslave them. You strip them of their culture. You strip them of everything. And make them into what you want them to be, is what I got. On page 187, it says, in practice, however, things turned out very differently. And I highlighted this, only a very small minority of West Africans obtained French citizenship and therefore the same rights as Frenchmen. Moreover, very soon, as early as the first decade of the 20th century, in fact, the policy of assimilation had been abandoned for a system of association. So we went from assimilating to associating. And they always say guilty by association. So this involved the attempt by France to govern and administer her West African colonies through reorganized West African institutions rather than rely exclusively on French institutions. Because of a shortage of French personnel, African chiefs, for example, stripped of many of their powers, were to act as go-betweens. So you use them. As one governor general of former French West Africa explained, they were to serve our purposes among the people. What obtained, therefore, in the practice in the French colonial territories was a form of indirect rule, similar to that operated by the British and their colonies. Before turning to the British occupation of West Africa, I want to simply list the present-day West African states which were once colonized by France. So they are Mauritania, Mauretania, Senegal, Mali, Niger, Upper Volta, Guinea, which is also the Conakry, the Ivory Coast, and the People's Republic of Benin, the Dahomey tribe. Togo, occupied by Germany in 1884, was divided vertically between France and Britain after World War I and placed under French and British mandate by the League of Nations in 1922. Okay? So we jump on over page 189. I'll read from there. So I highlighted that first sentence. It says, Britain then came out of the scramble with 4 colonies: Nigeria, the Gold Coast, Ghana, Sierra Leone, and the Gambia. She also administered part of Togo after World War II. Portugal held on to her possessions in Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, and the small islands of Sao Tome and Principe, while Germany lost her colonies of Togo and the Cameroons after World War II. So then I'm going to read a little bit on page 189, last paragraph here under the subtitle Colonial Policy Towards Islam in West Africa. It says, by positivism, I mean here the philosophy propounded by men like Auguste Comte in 1798 to 1857, regarded as the founding father of sociology as an academic discipline. According to Comte, the subject matter of sociology was the history of the human race regarded as a whole. However, Comte tended to see the history of Europe as synonymous with the history of the human race and believed that all civilizations would necessarily develop along the same lines as Western civilization. Moreover, he maintained in his law of the 3 stages of intellectual development. And this is where it gets me, where you think about all the knowledge that Africa has given the world. Everyone stole from Africa. And so religion, we are spiritual people, we are ancestral people, indigenous people to the land. But all of this information was stolen, right? But if you listen to how Comte says the law of 3 stages of intellectual development and where it begins and ends, I just found it very interesting, especially because religion only thrives off of fear and guilt. Keep that in mind. But he goes on to say that, moreover, he maintained in his law of 3 stages of intellectual development that human thought gradually evolves, passing from the lowest stage, the theological stage, to the intermediate stage, which is the metaphysical stage, to the most advanced stage, the scientific or positivist stage. And in the religious sphere, also, there were stages of evolution. Comte maintained that religion originated in fetishism, I can't talk today, that is the worship of animals and inanimate objects, and developed through a stage of polytheism until it reached its highest form in monotheism. So this is where you see that one God, right? Where you see Allah being the only God, the one God, or you see the Christianity introduced, because it's this theory that polytheism was one stage, and the highest form you could be is that one. One God, one thing, one way, our way. And I just thought that was very interesting that it comes from the law of 3 stages of intellectual development. And it's coming from people who were technically developed after us, not before. We have the most wisdom in the world, the African diaspora in Africa. So I just found that interesting, just to be general right there. Page 190, it also says, combined with the influence of Darwinism, evolutionary theory, and a general tendency to connect developments in religion to developments in the rest of the political, social, and cultural system of society, Comtean positivism exercised considerable influence over the thought and outlook of many people during his own lifetime and throughout the 19th and early decades of the 20th century. Finally, before leaving Comte, I should add that he, like the well-known sociologist Emily Durkheim, believed that religion was an important element in society. Among other things, it has cemented societies together and provided legitimitations or justifications essential for the maintenance and stability of social and political order. Okay? Then if we jump down to that next third paragraph, it says on page 190, whether they had read Comte or not, many French and British colonial officials and students of Islam in West Africa thought along the similar lines. In this context, O'Brien quotes from a doctoral thesis on French policy towards Islam in West Africa presented to the Sorbonne University in Paris in 1910 by the French scholar Quillian. The quotation reads, quote unquote, Muslims propaganda is a step towards civilization in West Africa, and it is universally recognized that the Muslim peoples of these regions are superior to those who have remained fetishists in social organizations, intellectual cultures, commerce, industry, well-being, style of life, and education. Moreover, the governor Fedherbe believed that Islam could be used both as a vehicle for the diffusion of a higher degree of civilization among Africans and as an instrument for the unification of French-occupied West Africa. This attitude explains his initial support for Maba Diakhouba. If you go back to chapter 5, the author says in page 142. However, where Islam appeared to be strong and a possible threat to French interests, steps were taken to undermine it. This is what happened in the case of Tokolor Empire and in the innumerable other instances that you can see in chapter 5. So this is kind of like just a little bit of a breakdown of what was happening and how they really, acted as if they wanted to assimilate with African culture, and then also just regard those 3 steps of intellectual development as well as having monotheism, the most highest. So convincing people that what they're doing is not actually the highest level of intellectual development, and that they needed to believe in this one world, one God type of ideology, which it's okay. But then again, it's not okay. Colonialism is not okay. Convincing a people for political and social gain. Okay. And I just wanted to make that just flat out, just what I wanted to say for that. Okay. So we're going to jump on in. I'll just summarize chapter 7 from the author's perspective. So he says, on page 229, in conclusion, for Islam, then, the colonial era was one of rapid expansion. According to the one estimate, 34% of the total population of West Africa was Muslim by the 1950s. We have seen that in the southern region of the Ivory Coast and western Nigeria and in the upper Volta, among the other places, Islam made considerable headway during the period of 1900 to 1960. By 1960, moreover, Mauritania was almost 100% Muslim, and Muslims formed the majority of the population of Senegal, the Gambia, Guinea, and Mali by the same date. There was also a very substantial Muslim population in Liberia and Sierra Leone by independence. In the colonial period, the administrations adopted different policies towards Islamic as circumstances dictated, and the Islamic responses to colonialism were highly complex and varied. Moreover, adherents of the traditional religions reacted in a variety of different ways to Islamic penetration, while Muslims adopted different approaches towards indigenous religions. While in Western Nigeria and the Ivory Coast, for example, there were what amounted to a mass conversions to Islam from the indigenous religions, attempts were made elsewhere to revive the indigenous religion and turn it into a barrier against Islamic penetration. Such a revival was led by Mpeni Dembele in Wallo in the district of San in Mali. Mpeni Dembele, the man of Wallo, it stands for, is said to have been the recipient of revelations in 1945, and inspired and guided by these revelations, he attempted to unify local rituals and reinforce the traditional moral basis of rural society. The relations between Muslims and Christians were at the official level in certain areas characterized by mutual suspicion and competition. At the grassroots in the towns and villages, these relations were generally speaking characterized by mutual tolerance and respect. Although at this level also there was a debate and competition, and on occasion attitudes of superiority were adopted by both sides. As was the case during other periods, there were during the colonial era a variety of strands to Islam in West Africa, some of which were to an extent the product of the rather bizarre situation created by colonialism. There were, for example, revivalists who emphasize the uniqueness and all-embracing eternal relevance of the Quranic teaching and who oppose any form of change or innovation, which meant that, among other things, they oppose all Western ways and ideas. Then there were others who, while believing that they were being just as faithful to the Quran, looked for ways and means of reconciling Islamic teaching with ideas and practices that they had claimed were in appearance only foreign to Islam, whether they were Western or a part of the indigenous culture and heritage. Then, without much debate or reference to the Quran or the Hadith, there were those Muslims who were prepared to absorb into Islam a variety of different influences, ideas, and practices, regardless of whether or not they were doctrinal justification for doing so. Finally, we saw the colonialism approach its sudden death. Islam in many parts of West Africa was becoming more organized and began increasingly, once again, as had been the case in the pre-colonial period, to strengthen its links with the rest of the Muslim world. These two trends are among the most striking aspects of Islam's development in West Africa in the post-colonial period. So we'll end there, and that was again Chapter 7, Colonial Rule, an era of rapid expansion and development, 1900s to 1960. Go ahead and wrap up this book. We are done reading. We will summarize the last few chapters next week as we introduce the next book. But I will tell you that Chapter 8 is about 1960s to 1980s, Islam since independence, and some case studies. And that will be the last chapter, and then we'll finally wrap up with the conclusion. I'll read there next week, but the conclusion is the African conversion to Islam and some general comments from Peter B. Clarke. But you are reading with the Real Book Club, where we read every Tuesday. Make sure you read. We just got wrapped up Islam in West Africa by Peter B. Clarke. I'm going to pass it over to our hostess with the mostest. She's going to close this out.
With the mostest coming at you, how it sounds. Excited that we're finishing up this book. I hope you guys did follow our mission and gain knowledge of self through education, reading, and activating doing. And you enjoyed the summaries and the summations of this book. I know it's heavy lifting, but come on, we got to get our arms and our minds strong. So exercise your body, your soul, and your brain by reading. We're here every Tuesday at R3 Realives, where you can see us. If you want to know what we're doing and what we're reading, go to at R3 Realives, which will take you to all of our social media, which is Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and the website. You don't have to remember that. All you got to do is remember at R3 Realives. And on the website, you can like on all of the platforms, you can like, share, and follow for free. We also accept donations for our campaigns, such as scholarships in the name of Willie James Mims, our first annual one. We have $2,500 available for students that we are evaluating essays right now. We'd like to get 500 more so that we can give 3 students $1,000. So if you're in for the donate, press that button and donate to us. We will update you on the website and next week. That's to the next book that we are reading. So come on at R3 Real Lives, where we promote knowledge of self, education, and activism. We'll see you every Tuesday because we will be here, rain, shine, sleet, or snow. You know, R3, we got to go. Back to you, kid.
All right, that was perfect. See you guys next week on Tuesdays, where we read. The Real Book Club reads every Tuesday. Use your Real Eyes, R3, Real Eyes, Realives, where we promote knowledge of self through education and activism. And what better way to do that than to read, write, and comprehend for your own understanding. And I'm the hostess I'm the CEO and the founder. That was the hostess with the mostest. We will see you next week. Peace, or we say 3.